The first time the rule was broken, it did not feel like a war declaration or even a serious mistake. It felt like paperwork, a quiet vote in a chamber that had seen 10,000 such votes before, where the representatives of the Heliox Compact listened to a report about humanity with mild boredom, noting the species classification of cooperative, low threat, emotionally volatile but strategically unimaginative, a people who negotiated loudly and fought rarely, who expanded slowly, who invested more in rescue fleets and disaster relief than in armadas. And when the vote came to tighten trade corridors around human space to force compliance with a new transit tax meant to favor older members of the Compact, no one objected. Because cornering a species like that seemed harmless, almost educational, a way to remind the younger civilizations how the galaxy worked. And far from the chamber, on a human logistics station orbiting a dim red star, Captain Elias Morano watched cargo manifests, failed to clear one after another, watched the delays stack up, watched the algorithms flag shortages not just of luxury goods but of medical isotopes and reactor parts, and he did not shout or slam his console. He simply forwarded the data to Earth with a short note that said the lanes are closing faster than projected, while on Earth the message joined thousands of others in a network that did not panic but calculated, because humanity had learned a long time ago that the worst mistakes were made loudly, and the best responses were prepared quietly. So while Compact analysts congratulated themselves on applying pressure without violence, human planners dusted off contingents of files that had not been opened in generations, files created after different cornering, back when humanity was still learning what the galaxy would try to take if allowed, and the file did not contain battle plans first, but maps of people, of colonies, of supply dependencies, of allies who would starve first, and enemies who would grow complacent fastest. And as weeks passed, the Compact tightened the ring, closing ports, denying refuel requests, citing regulations written in languages most humans did not bother to learn anymore, and every denial was logged, time-stamped, categorized, not for outrage but for pattern recognition. And the pattern was clear. The Compact was not trying to destroy humanity. It was trying to box it in, to make it smaller, quieter, easier to manage. And in the past that tactic had worked on dozens of species who lacked the will or imagination to respond. But humans responded by doing something that confused observers. They complied publicly while expanding privately, rerouting shipping through marginal systems, activating shipyards listed as historical sites, refitting exploration vessels with modular hardpoints that had never been removed but rarely used. And Ambassador Lian Okoye stood before the Compact again with a calm expression and asked for clarification on the regulations, not to win the argument but to keep the clock running, because time was the only weapon the Compact had given them, and time was the one thing humanity had learned how to weaponize better than anyone else. And as the corners tightened, the human public grew restless but not hysterical, because every household broadcast carried the same message from different mouths. Stay steady. Help your neighbor. Conserve without hoarding. Trust that this has been anticipated. And the phrase "never corner humanity" began to circulate quietly, not as a threat but as a reminder from history teachers and veterans and engineers who knew what happened when humans felt there was no room left to step back, because when the last lane closed and Compact issued a final notice demanding revised treaties that would reduce human autonomy to a managed status, the response was not a fleet mobilization or a declaration of war, but a broadcast from Earth that lasted exactly 90 seconds, in which a human voice thanked the Compact for clarifying its position, stated that humanity would not accept the revised terms, and announced the suspension of all human compliance with Compact Transit Authority. And analysts laugh at first, because how could a boxing species suspend compliance with a system it depended on? But the laughter died as human ships began to move not outward but inward, converging on human space from every hidden yard and forgotten outpost, ships of unfamiliar configurations, hulls layered not for aesthetics but for redundancy, engines tuned for endurance rather than speed, and most unsettling of all, the ships did not form battle lines or defensive screens. They formed corridors, opening paths where none should exist, using technologies the Compact believed were theoretical at best and abandoned at worst. And Captain Morano found himself reassigned to one of these corridors, guiding civilian convoys through regions of space the Compact considered impossible. And when asked how this was possible, he answered honestly that humans had been practicing how to live without permission for a very long time, and in the compact chamber the mood shifted from confidence to irritation to something cold as reports came in that human supply levels were stabilizing instead of collapsing, that colonies predicted to beg for relief were instead exporting surplus, that allied species quietly rerouted their loyalty toward the humans who had not abandoned them, and a senior compact strategist finally asked a question that should have been asked at the beginning: what if cornering them was a wrong move? But by then the corners were walls, and humanity was no longer facing outward looking for approval. It was facing inward, unified, efficient, and preparing not for conquest but for survival on its own terms, which in the long memory of the galaxy had always been the most dangerous phase of any species, because the rule was never about human aggression. It was about human adaptation, and the galaxy had just forced humanity to adapt again. As the corridors stabilized and human space stopped shrinking on the compact's charts, the real fear did not come from the admirals or the merchant, but from the analysts whose job it was to model behavior, because every predictive system they ran began to diverge wildly from known patterns, showing humanity not lashing out but reorganizing, not pleading but optimizing. And the Heliox Compact had never known how to respond to a species that treated pressure as a design constraint rather than an existential threat. And inside the human systems a change was palpable, not loud but focused, as factories shifted schedules without orders, communities restructured supply chains without waiting for directives, and local council coordinated with orbital logistics officers as if they had rehearsed this exact moment, which in truth they had quietly, in simulations buried under the label of extreme improbability. While on Mars, Dr. Hannah Verma watched an old propulsion test bed come back online. A system dismissed decades earlier as inefficient because it traded speed for resilience, a human trait that never tested well in peacetime metrics but excelled when redundancy mattered more than elegance, and Verma smiled as she logged performance numbers that made compact engineers look foolish in hindsight, because humans had never stopped developing the technology they pretended to abandon. They simply stopped advertising it. And as more corridors opened, Ambassador Okoye began receiving private messages from compact member species who were suddenly very interested in bilateral discussions, small civilizations that had lived under compact rules long enough to know what happened when those rules tightened, and Okoye listened without committing, because humanity had learned another rule the hard way: never trade leverage for gratitude, and instead she offered humanitarian aid, technical support, evacuation assistance, things humans gave easily and remembered quietly and across. The galaxy human ships appeared not as invaders, but as helpers, stabilizing failing reactors, restoring collapsed habitats, escorting refugee flotillas through the same forbidden routes a compact had failed to secure, and every act carried a subtext a compact could not censor. Humans do not need your permission to move. And the more the compact attempted to reassert control, the more obvious their limitations became, because their fleets were designed for dominance, not persistence. 4. Decisive engagements, not prolonged presence in hostile or resource-poor regions, and human vessels lingered where compact ships rotated out, stayed where others withdrew, repaired themselves where others required dockyards, and Captain Morano found himself escorting an alien convoy whose captain asked a question many were thinking but few dared voice: "Why did your people let us believe you were weaker than this?" And Morano answered after pause that humans did not let anyone believe anything. They simply did not correct assumptions that made others comfortable, and the truth of that spread faster than any broadcast, unsettling compact more than 1,000 threats could have, because it meant their intelligence failures were not due to deception but to arrogance, and in the compact chamber the first open fractures appeared as representatives argued whether the cornering strategy had backfired, some demanding escalation, others urging de-escalation, but escalation required confidence and de-escalation required humility, and the compact had cultivated neither in sufficient quantity. While humanity continued to do the one thing the compact had not planned for, it kept building not just ships but systems, overlapping networks of support that reduced dependency on any single route or authority. And as weeks turned into months, the corner became irrelevant, because humanity was no longer pressed against it. It had grown around it, and in a classified compact report marked for emergency circulation only, a junior analyst summarized the situation with brutal clarity, stating that humanity could no longer be effectively coerced through isolation, that further pressure would likely accelerate human self-sufficiency and regional influence, and that the original rule regarding humans, the one dismissed as superstition by senior leadership, should be formally reinstated. Never corner humanity, because once cornered they do not fight for dominance. They fight to make the corner meaningless, and by the time the report reached the upper council, human envoys were already requesting a special session, not to beg for relief but to propose revisions to compact law that reflected the new reality. And for the first time since a compact's founding, the representatives faced a species that had been tested, constrained, and had responded not by breaking but by evolving. And the galaxy was beginning to understand that this was only the second phase of a very old pattern. By the time the special session convened, the compact chamber felt smaller than it ever had, not physically but psychologically, as if the walls themselves were aware that the balance they had enforced for centuries was being quietly rewritten. And when Ambassador Okoye entered, she did not bring a delegation of admirals or a threat display. She brought engineers, logisticians, and cultural liaisons, people who spoke in numbers and procedures rather than ultimatums, which unsettled the council more than any war posture could have, because it suggested humanity was not here to negotiate an end to the crisis, but to formalize a system that no longer centered compact at all. And Okoye began by presenting data that could not be dismissed as propaganda. Graphs showing human dependency on compact lanes dropping to near zero, projections of self-sustaining trade webs spanning neutral and unclaimed space, and models indicating that even total military interdiction would only accelerate decentralization rather than restore control. And as murmurs rippled through the chamber, a senior compact admiral interrupted to accuse humanity of strategic deception, of hiding capabilities in violation of trust. And Okoye responded calmly that no treaty required humanity to disclose every method by which it kept its people alive, and that trust, if it was to be invoked, should perhaps have been considered before the vote to corner an entire civilization. And elsewhere the consequences were already unfolding, because compact enforcement fleets sent to reassert authority found themselves shadowed not by human warships but by civilian traffic that refused to reroute, convoys protected by mutual aid pacts and escorted by mixed crews of humans and allied species, creating a political nightmare where firing a shot would mean openly attacking non-compact civilians. And commanders hesitated, requested clarification, delayed, and every delay weakened the illusion of absolute control. While on Earth, President Rafael Ionescu addressed the public not with triumph but with restraint, reminding them that survival was a goal, not revenge, and that the galaxy was watching how humans behaved when they no longer needed to comply, a lesson learned from history when sudden strength often led to overreach. And in the shipyards orbiting Luna, older hull designs were rolled out not as museum pieces but as templates. Ships built to be repaired with minimal infrastructure, to be crewed by small teams trained across multiple disciplines, reflecting a philosophy that assumed help might not come and designed accordingly, and this philosophy baffled compact observers accustomed to specialization and centralized support, because human systems thrived under decentralization, a trait born not of spacefaring genius, but of centuries spent surviving on a chaotic planet where redundancy meant life. And the deeper the compact looked, the more uncomfortable the picture became, because humanity's strength was not any single technology or fleet, but a cultural reflex toward adaptation, toward turning constraints into norms and norms into strengths. And when a compact delegate finally asked a question that cut through the noise, "What does humanity want now?" the chamber went quiet, and Okoye answered without drama that humanity wanted the compact to stop pretending it could corner independent civilizations without consequences, to revise transit authority to be opt-in rather than coercive, to recognize autonomous corridors as legitimate, and to acknowledge that protection and cooperation could not be extracted through pressure. And the audacity of the request stunned many, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was backed by proof that humanity would proceed regardless of approval. And in that moment some council members realized the true mistake had not been underestimating human weapons or technology, but underestimating human patience, because humans had not reacted to the first squeeze or the second or even the third. They had waited until the corner was complete, until there was no ambiguity left about intent. And only then had they moved, unified and decisive. And as the session adjourned without resolution, compact analysts updated their internal threat assessments, quietly reclassifying humanity not as a rising power or a destabilizing force, but as a structural anomaly, a civilization whose presence altered the behavior of systems around it simply by existing. And out in the corridors, Captain Morano guided another convoy through a region once marked forbidden, watching stars drift past that had never before appeared on sanctioned maps. And he thought of the old rule again, not as a boast, but as a warning the galaxy had ignored at its own expense, because once humanity learned it could survive without the center would never matter in the same way again. The aftermath of the unresolved session did not erupt into chaos as many compact hardliners predicted. Instead, it settled into a tense, grinding recalibration as enforcement fleets received increasingly cautious orders and trade hubs once rigid in protocol began quietly accepting human flag vessels under the justification of local discretion. And the slow erosion of centralized authority terrified the compact more than any sudden rebellion because it revealed how brittle their control had become when faced with a species that refused to play by inherited assumptions, and within human space the response was not celebratory but methodical, as councils reviewed contingency thresholds and updated response matrices not to exploit the compact's hesitation but to ensure stability if it fractured, because humanity remembered too well what power vacuums did to the innocent. And Dr. Vomer's propulsion teams were now field testing corridor generators at scale, devices that bent, navigational constraints just enough to make old choke points obsolete without tearing space-time apart, a subtlety lost on compact engineers who had always favored brute force solutions. And as these corridors proliferated, information flowed faster than fleets ever could, spreading stories of human aid and reliability that contrasted sharply with the compact's reputation for conditional assistance. And species that had once whispered complaints in private began coordinating openly with human logisticians, forming what compact intelligence labeled informal coalitions, but what humans simply called mutual survival networks. And the language mattered, because coalitions implied aggression while survival implied necessity, and Ambassador Okoye levers that distinction relentlessly in every communication, framing humanity's actions as responses to imposed constraints rather than bids for dominance. A framing that resonated deeply with worlds that had felt the slow squeeze of compact policy for generations. And inside the compact chamber factions hardened, with one bloc arguing that humanity's influence had to be broken now before it rewrote the Galactic Order, while another warned that any attempt at force would unify even more systems under human coordination. And the debate stalled not because of disagreement, but because no one could propose a plan that accounted for human persistence, for their willingness to absorb pain without fracturing, and this paralysis became visible when a compact patrol attempted to seize a human freighter on a technical violation and found itself surrounded within hours not by weapons but by documentation, legal challenges filed simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions by mixed-species crews invoking compact law more precisely than the compact itself had done in decades, forcing a retreat that echoed across the networks as proof that the rules could be turned inward. And President Ionescu addressed the human public again, acknowledging the growing fear that the standoff might still end in violence, and reminding them that preparedness was not provocation, that restraint was not weakness, and that the goal was not to humiliate the compact but to survive without kneeling, words that steadied a population raised on the stories of past corners where panic had cost lives. And in orbit, Captain Morano watched a new generation of pilots trained not for dogfights but for endurance runs and crisis mediation, learning how to navigate hostile negotiations as deftly as hostile space, because the human doctrine had quietly shifted from winning battles to outlasting systems, and as compact intelligence finally compiled a comprehensive profile of humanity's response, a senior analyst summarized the pattern with growing unease, noting that humanity did not escalate linearly, did not mirror aggression, did not seek catharsis through dominance, but instead applied pressure to weak points in the structure itself, turning rigid hierarchies into liabilities. And the analyst concluded that the compact's greatest vulnerability was not military inferiority but institutional inflexibility, a vulnerability humanity seemed uniquely equipped to exploit simply by continuing to exist as it always had, adaptable, stubborn, and unwilling to accept that being cornered meant being trapped, and far beyond the chambers and shipyards. In quiet systems now linked by unofficial routes, the galaxy was beginning to operate differently, not because humanity demanded it, but because once shown another way, many worlds found they could not unsee it, and the rule the compact had dismissed was spreading again, not as a threat carved into warnings, but as a practical lesson written into policy drafts and navigation charts. Never corner humanity, because doing so did not end with resistance. It ended with change that could not be reversed. The tipping point arrived without a declaration, without a fleet engagement, and without the kind of spectacle compact's war planners had spent careers preparing for, because it began with resignations, quiet ones at first, as mid-level administrators stepped down citing jurisdictional ambiguity, followed by entire regulatory offices suspending operations because their enforcement authority no longer mapped cleanly onto a galaxy threaded with autonomous corridors. And as these gaps widened, the compact discovered a truth it had never needed to face before. that its power had always depended on universal participation rather than raw force, and humanity had just demonstrated a viable alternative, and on Earth the response remained disciplined as oversight committees audited every human action for signs of overreach, painfully aware that becoming what they resisted would invalidate everything they had built. While Ambassador Okoye refused celebratory interviews and instead spent her days mediating dispute between non-compact worlds newly emboldened to renegotiate old obligations, ensuring that human involvement did not replace one center coercion with another, because the lesson of the corner was not about flipping the board but about removing the walls, and in the field Captain Morano encountered compact patrols that no longer challenged his transit, their commanders opting instead for neutral observation, some even requesting shared navigational data under the table. A quiet admission that the old maps were failing, and these small concessions accumulated into a strategic collapse more profound than any battlefield loss, because a compact could not punish defection without accelerating it, could not enforce rules without exposing their selective application, and could not escalate militarily without unifying a region that now saw humans not as conquerors but as proof that independence was survivable, and when a hardline faction finally pushed through authorization for a limited show of force against peripheral human hub, the result was anticlimactic and devastating to compact credibility. Because the hub evacuated within hours through redundant routes, the surrounding systems refused to provide staging support, and the attacking force arrived to find empty docks and automated systems broadcasting legal notices documenting compact violations in multiple languages, a bloodless encounter that spread across the galaxy as a cautionary tale. And back in the chamber, the vote that followed was not about humanity but about the compact itself, whether it would reform or fracture. And as delegates argued, President Ionescu transmitted a single message addressed not to the Council but to the galaxy at large, stating that humanity would continue to trade, assist, and cooperate with any who chose mutual respect, that it would defend its people and its partners if threatened, and that it would no longer pretend that survival required submission. A statement notable not for its defiance but for its final line, which expressed regret that it had taken a corner to remind everyone of a rule they once knew, and as the transmission ended and the chamber descended into chaos, analysts across the stars updated their models again, this time removing the compact as a fixed point around which everything else revolved, because the galaxy had crossed an invisible threshold, and humanity, without firing a shot, had proven that the most dangerous response to being cornered was not rage but resilience scaled to a civilization, a truth the compact was only beginning to grasp as the old order quietly came apart around it. What followed the compact's internal crisis was not immediate dissolution but a drawn-out reckoning as systems long bound by habit began testing what life looked like without automatic compliance, and in that uncertainty humanity became an unexpected stabilizer, not by issuing commands but by continuing to behave predictably, honoring contracts, delivering aid on schedule, and responding to disputes with the same measured tone it had used when cornered, a consistency that reassured worlds. Suddenly aware that freedom without structure could be just another kind of danger, and Ambassador Okoye convened multilateral forums that excluded no one, including compact loyalists, framing them not as replacements for existing institutions but as pressure valves where grievances could be aired without fear of reprisal, a simple innovation that exposed how rarely the compact had allowed dissent without punishment. And across human space emergency doctrines quietly shifted into long-term frameworks as temporary corridors were reinforced into permanent arteries, education programs expanded to train mixed-species crews, and legal scholars worked alongside engineers to codify principles of transit and aid that prioritized transparency over authority, because humanity understood that systems endured only when they could be understood by those living under them. And Captain Morano, now overseeing a regional network rather than a single corridor, watched former compact patrol ships dock voluntarily to retrofit their drives to endurance rather than intimidation, their crews pragmatic enough to adapt when doctrine failed, and these individual choices aggregated into a cultural shift that compact leadership could no longer ignore, because every adaptation weakened the narrative that order required domination, and when the Council finally reconvened with quorum barely intact, the proposals on the table were no longer about punishing humanity, but about salvaging relevance, suggesting reforms that mirrored what humans had already implemented, opt-in transit frameworks, shared enforcement, humanitarian exemptions that could not be overridden by political whim. And as these ideas were debated, a veteran compact historian addressed the chamber with a reminder drawn from archived warnings. explaining that the rule about never cornering humanity had never been about fear of human violence, but about fear of human example, because when pressed, humans did not simply break free. They demonstrated alternatives that made old systems obsolete, and the historian's word resonated beyond the chamber as recordings circulated, reframing humanity's rise not as an anomaly but as a mirror held up to a stagnant order. And on Earth, President Ionescu announced a gradual drawdown of emergency authorities, signaling confidence that humanity no longer needed to operate in crisis mode. A move that surprised allies and skeptics alike, because it showed restraint at the moment of greatest leverage, reinforcing the message that humans sought sustainability rather than supremacy. And in distant systems where children grew up traveling through routes once forbidden, the idea of a single center dictating movement already felt archaic, and the galaxy began to stabilize around a looser, more resilient web of relationships, not free of conflict but less vulnerable to coercion. And as analysts updated their final assessments, many concluded that the true consequence of cornering humanity was not the loss of control, but the loss of inevitability, because a compact had always presented itself as the only viable way, and humanity had survived long enough under pressure to prove that there were others. The final reckoning did not arrive as a ceremony or surrender, but as a normalization, the quiet moment when the galaxy realized it had been living differently for long enough that returning to the old way no longer made sense, and the Heliox Compact, diminished but not destroyed, formally ratified reforms that acknowledged autonomous corridors and shared authority, not because humanity demanded it, but because enough members had already adapted to the new reality that resisting it would have meant irrelevance. And when Ambassador Okoye signed the final accord, she did so without triumph, noting publicly that the Compact had chosen survival through change rather than collapse through pride, words that carried weight because they echoed the human experience that had sparked the transformation. And on Earth, President Ionescu addressed the public one last time on the matter, declaring the corner officially over and reminding them that vigilance would remain necessary because systems could always tighten again if forgotten, a warning received not with fear but with a steady confidence earned through trial. And Captain Morano, preparing to retire from active corridor duty, guided one last convoy through a route that now appeared on official charts, watching young pilots joke with mixed-species crews who treated the journey as routine rather than defiant, a small sign that the extraordinary had become ordinary. And across the stars, historians began revising their accounts. No longer framing the episode as a near war, but as a structural shift triggered by miscalculation, emphasizing that humanity had not sought to dominate or withdraw, but to remove the walls that made cornering possible. And in that reframing, the old rule took on its final form, no longer a warning whispered by cautious diplomats, but a lesson embedded in policy and culture. Never corner humanity, not because they will destroy you, but because they will show you a way that makes your corner irrelevant. And as generations passed and the memory of the squeeze faded into textbooks, the galaxy endured not because one power held it together, but because many learned how to stand without being pressed, and humanity, having proven once again that survival was its most dangerous talent, returned to what it had always done best, building, cooperating, and quietly preparing for the day someone might forget the rule again.